What if everything you were promised turned out to be only half true? An entire generation was raised to believe they were exceptional, pushed themselves beyond expectations, and still ended up unable to afford the kind of life that had seemed completely ordinary just one generation before. That sounds less like coincidence and more like a social experiment no one consciously agreed to join. I'm talking about millennials, those born between 1981 and 1996. And before you dismiss this with a sigh, stick with me, because this becomes uncomfortable in ways you may not have considered. Millennials became the first generation in modern American history projected to be financially worse off than their parents. The Pew Research Center confirmed this in 2020. That leaves an entire demographic walking around every day carrying a strange psychological blend of accomplishment and inadequacy tangled together in their minds. Picture growing up constantly, hearing that you could become anything, achieve anything, win at anything, only to graduate into an economic downturn where the new participation trophy is a master's degree priced higher than houses once were. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance, and millennials are practically immersed in it. But this goes far beyond student debt and jokes about avocado toast. Psychologist Jean Twenge even wrote a book titled Generation Me, examining this very dynamic. Her research found that millennials score higher on measures of narcissism compared to earlier generations. Yet, and this is where it gets unsettling, they also report elevated levels of anxiety and depression. So you end up with a generation that can feel uniquely important and utterly insignificant at the same time. A trauma response dressed up with a polished LinkedIn profile. Pause for a moment and consider the timeline. Millennials effectively became the testing ground for parenting philosophies that emerged from the self-esteem movement of the 1980 seconds and 1990 seconds. Helicopter parenting. Everyone receiving a trophy, being told you're gifted simply for existing. The intentions weren't malicious, they were sincere efforts to improve parenting, guided by the psychological theories available at the time. Millennials stepped into their 20s just as the economy collapsed in 2008. They graduated into a labor market that had been fundamentally reshaped and were forced to confront an economic landscape nothing like the one they had been prepared for. The sheer whiplash of that shift should have sent people to the hospital. And then there was social media. Millennials didn't encounter it as children like Gen Z did. They met it during their teenage years and early adulthood, while their identities were still taking shape. Facebook debuted in 2004, and Instagram followed in 2010. In other words, millennials were figuring out how to function as adults at the exact same time they were learning to curate and broadcast their lives to an audience. Research by Dr. Tim Kasser on materialism and well-being indicates that when individuals anchor their self-esteem in external approval, which is precisely what social media conditions you to seek, their mental health deteriorates. It's like running a non-stop political campaign for your own existence, with polling that never ends. Now add another layer. Millennials are postponing or entirely foregoing the traditional milestones that once anchored adult identity. Marriage, owning a home, raising children. Data shows they genuinely desire these milestones. Yet the financial landscape makes them nearly unattainable without inherited wealth or exceptional luck. As a result, you have people in their 30s and 40s who still feel as though their real lives haven't begun, except the waiting room is a $2,500 a month studio apartment, and their therapist's next opening isn't until March. The psychological toll of prolonged uncertainty is well established. When the benchmark society associates with adulthood feel out of reach, the brain doesn't simply accept it and move forward. Instead, it generates a persistent, low-grade stress known as allostatic load, the body's habit of bracing for an event that never actually arrives. It's like being trapped on the loading screen of your own life, and when you glance at the progress bar, it hasn't shifted at all over the past 10 years. But here's something that may strike closer to home. Millennials were handed a very specific narrative, that hard work inevitably produces results. Work hard in school, earn a degree, land a solid job, and steadily climb the ladder. That unwritten agreement felt simple and reliable, and for decades, it actually delivered. But then the economic terrain transformed in ways few people foresaw. When millennials stepped forward, prepared to follow that roadmap, they discovered tuition had skyrocketed to nearly 10 times its former cost. Entry-level positions demanded 5 years of prior experience, and they were handed $70,000 in student debt, alongside a gig economy offering contract work without benefits. The psychological label for a moment when reality shatters your core assumptions about how the world operates is schema disruption. And when that rupture unfolds across an entire generation, it produces more than frustration. It reshapes how a whole age group perceives institutions, authority, and even the idea of a dependable future. That helps explain why millennials are so often described as both hopeful and intensely skeptical at the same time. They continue to believe the system should be just, they simply no longer trust that it actually is. It's pattern recognition playing out in real time. And then there's the workplace narrative. Millennials are constantly criticized for switching jobs and lacking company loyalty. But here's what makes that critique psychologically intriguing. Corporate America had already redefined the employment contract long before millennials entered the workforce. Pension plans vanished, stable full-time roles were replaced with temporary or contract positions, and large-scale layoffs became a routine business tactic. Millennials didn't create this erosion of loyalty, they adjusted to a labor market that had already shifted. Their behavior reflects a rational adaptation to an environment where employees are often treated as replaceable. Yet this part rarely gets emphasized enough. Millennials are also among the most highly educated generations ever, and one of the most diverse. When people think about them, teen internet culture often comes to mind first. They were the first cohort to come of age alongside the rise of the internet. Growing up in that environment shaped a distinct psychological tendency, one inclined to question everything, having witnessed how narratives can shift depending on who controls the story. Those who challenge the status quo are frequently branded as entitled or troublesome. But when critical thinking collides with systems that were never built to withstand scrutiny, it's bound to look that way. For millennials, the mental health dialogue stands apart. They are the first generation to broadly normalize therapy and to speak openly about anxiety and depression as legitimate conditions rather than personal shortcomings. That shift is enormous. Yet it's unfolding while they navigate circumstances that are objectively more intense. Student debt levels once considered unimaginable, housing prices rising far beyond wage growth, and an economy structured around chronic job instability. The result is a strange paradox: heightened self-awareness paired with deeper overwhelm. And let's pause to consider the future. Millennials are also the generation watching environmental decline happen in real time, all while being told they're responsible for fixing it despite holding comparatively less institutional influence and fewer resources than the scale of the problem demands. It's existential anxiety, mixed with a persistent sense of powerlessness. Climate anxiety is now recognized as a genuine psychological phenomenon, and millennials are directly in its path. What emerges is a generation molded by extreme expectations, financial volatility, non-stop performance pressure, postponed milestones of adulthood, and a front-row view of multiple overlapping crises. Yet society often responds with, "Why are you so anxious?" Or, "Why don't you just buy a house?" When you examine the conditions they've endured, the psychology of millennials becomes strikingly logical. They are reacting the way humans typically do when the ground shifts beneath them and the blueprint they were handed no longer aligns with reality. If this resonated with you, consider subscribing.